Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today for a Bite Out of Science. Take a Bite Out of Science is a virtual lunch and learn series where the HawkWatch International staff share scientific research, findings, and more in bite-sized nuggets digestible for anyone and everyone. These presentations are made possible by the Salt Lake County ZAP program and the generosity of supporters like you. So thank you so much. Today, we are going to be talking about what a raptor is. It turns out there's a lot to consider, and this isn't just a fun academic exercise. The definition has important implications due to the definition's influence on research priorities, funding decisions, and conservation actions. So we are joined today by Dr. Dave Oleyar, the Director of Long-Term Monitoring and Community Science, for this short lunchtime presentation. Dave, will you take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten, and thanks for those of you taking time to eat your lunch and hear about raptors. You see here an image of one of our migration crew members, Shelley Kramer, releasing a golden eagle at the Go Shoot Mountains HawkWatch. And we do a lot of this across the West in the fall and have done quite a bit of research for 35 years now on raptors and their conservation. If you are new to HawkWatch International, our mission is to conserve the environment through education, long-term monitoring, and scientific research on raptors as indicators of ecosystem health. And in the process of doing that over the years, anyone who's worked on a raptor-related project for HawkWatch or any of the other organizations that work with raptors or just been watching hawks because they're cool have probably had the conversation or been asked the question, and I know that we get it quite a lot, is, you know, what is a raptor anyway? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time this afternoon thinking about what a raptor is and how raptors can be defined in some different ways. And so I don't think there are many people that would see this view of a red-tailed hawk and a turkey vulture. This is an image taken by one of our crew members at the Grand Canyon HawkWatch. Would probably think that at least one of the birds in this picture is considered a raptor or a bird of prey. And so we're going to talk about what makes that definition and what makes that group a distinct group, if you will, here in a second. But before we do that, I want to open a quick poll for the audience here. And let's give you 2 minutes here, or a minute and a half, I think, to really quickly, it says 5, we're not going to go 5 minutes, answer questions about which of these groups do you consider to be a raptor? You didn't know you're going to get to be interactive today. So are hawks raptors? Are eagles raptors? What about osprey? What about harriers? What about owls? How about ravens or shrikes? Cormorants? We're going to give it about 30 more seconds before I close this poll. And we might have everyone done. Everyone has started the poll, so we'll close it now. I'm assuming you all can see this. All right. Edit questions. Share poll results. So you can see these poll results, and 100% of the people talking in here to talk about raptors today think that hawks are raptors, and eagles, and osprey, and harriers, and falcons. One of you doesn't think owls is a raptor. 2 of you don't think vultures are raptors. Only 3 lump shrikes into the raptor group. And no one in attendance right now thinks of ravens as raptors. And that's okay. None of these answers are necessarily right or wrong. But the response to this poll reflects sort of the response and the thinking in the raptor and scientific and general community over the years. And that's that different groups and different people have thought of raptors in different ways over the time. And so Hawks, eagles, owls, falcons, these are the same groups you just took a poll on. These are the common groups of birds that have at various times been considered or talked about being raptors, right? And so it turns out, just like everyone here today, almost universally, the biology world considers hawks, eagles, and falcons to be raptors, pretty much always. Vultures and owls, just like in our poll here, are frequently thought of as raptors, but it's variable depending on who you talk to. Um, and then occasionally, shrikes and ravens are also considered raptors, and they show up in studies of raptors of other different species because they're similar, and they've shown up in publications in journals that are focused on raptors, like the Journal of Raptor Research, right? So you think just like the general population tends to think. And if you look at the literature, or you look at published works on raptors, these two books, Ian Newton's seminal work, think of hawks and eagles and falcons, diurnal birds of prey, as raptors. And they describe the owls as a nocturnal equivalent to the raptor group. You go to other books, these three publications consider raptors as owls as raptors too, right? In the Raptor Research and Management Techniques manual that's put out by the Raptor Research Foundation, you can see you've got condors on the cover. So vultures and owls are considered raptors by different groups and different publications. And the whole point here being is that what's been lumped into being a raptor or not being a raptor has changed over time. It's dynamic and depends on who you talk to. And so you might be asking yourself right now, okay, I'm taking a few bites of my sandwich and have taken this poll about raptors, but does it really matter? What does defining a group mean? Okay. First off, it matters because there are organizations like HawkWatch and others. You can see some of their logos right here: the Peregrine Fund, the Teton Raptor Center, Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, Hawk Mountain, the Raptor Research Foundation, Humana, which is the Hawk Migration Association of North America, the Belize Raptor Institute, and Coastal Raptors. And this is just a small subsample of raptor dedicated research and conservation organizations. They focus on raptor conservation. And so to be able to focus on that, you need to know and have a definition of what it is you're focusing on. In addition to that, how we define raptors can influence research priorities, which species we focus on. If vultures aren't raptors, then perhaps the Peregrine Fund or HawkWatch or some other organization wouldn't spend time on vulture research. But if they are, then we do. That also influences funding decisions, where you spend money as an organization or where you can apply for and get money to do research. And it also matters for conservation actions when we make raptor management plans or set aside habitat reserves for raptors of different kinds. Then it's important to know what a raptor truly is. And so it's important to have a clear, defensible way for including or excluding a species or group of species into this label of raptor. And lots of people have thought about this. There's lots of publications about it. In 2017, in the Journal of Raptor Research, Craig Farquhar published a whole commentary, 7 pages long, on just the term raptor and its origins and how it had been used over the time, and then how it came to be termed and linked to birds of prey that grasp and take prey with their feet, right? And so in here, we use raptors and birds of prey simultaneously, and we're talking about currently existing birds and not the raptors that some of you might be thinking in terms of velociraptors or other predatory dinosaurs, which it's important to keep in mind that birds, including these birds that are raptors that we're talking about, have an evolutionary link to. They're actually the living descendants of these kinds of dinosaurs. Anything that's talked about here is this isn't to criticize how things have been done in the past, or lists of others, or criteria, or authors of any of this works. What this exercise in thought and thinking about how raptors is defined is really to kind of review and think about it and hopefully offer a path forward. And so a group of colleagues, and I headed by Chris McClure of the Peregrine Fund, and I think Chris is here today, so maybe he can chime in and correct me when I misstate something. But talked about this, and this culminated in a research presentation and then a publication in the Journal of Raptor Research defining raptors and birds of prey. And a lot of what you're going to see here is based off of that effort. So when we talk about raptors and people think about raptors, and I imagine many of you used these criteria when you were filling out your poll, we think about the physical traits or the morphological features of raptors. And Ian Newton, one of the predominant raptor ecologists around, defines in his book Population Ecology of Raptors that raptors describes them as having acute vision, strong legs and feet equipped with sharp curved claws and a hooked beak. And if you go to any of the raptor groups that I talked about earlier to their webpage, if they define what a raptor is, almost invariably they talk about these characteristics, or what we refer to as three sharps, right? This is a screenshot from the HawkWatch International webpage. What makes a raptor a raptor? And it talks about the three sharps. And in fact, that raptors have sharp vision, sharp talons, and sharp hooked upper bills to tear food apart. And these are definitely traits and features of birds that are raptorial, that are predatory, and many raptors share these traits. But you have to question and examine: are these criteria for inclusion or inclusion in the group of raptors? And so to do that, you might take a closer look. And the first thing to take a look at the three sharps is sharp vision. Most raptors are described as having very keen eyes and sharp vision, and it turns out that how you measure vision and define exceptional vision is a very variable trait, and there's a lot of ways you can do it. And when you do it different ways, you get different answers, right? Graham Martin published a work on the sensory ecology of birds, including vision, and so this information is taken out of that. But one way of measuring visual acuity is to look at the resolution at which birds see, and in measuring that, measured humans, right? So humans fall at around 72, 73, and then measured a variety of other birds and other raptors. And so when you look at the wedge-tailed eagle, you see it's up over 140, so much higher visual acuity based on this way of measuring it than humans, for sure. We add in a couple of old world vultures, and you can see they're up there as well. Here's a griffin vulture, not quite as high visual acuity as the others, but still outpaces people. We look at a falcon, and you see that brown falcon is a little bit closer to people. And what about the American kestrel, our friend, the American kestrel? This might surprise some of you to see that based on this way of measuring and assessing visual acuity, that kestrels have lower visual acuity than humans. And so does caracara, black kite, turkey vultures, and black vultures, Harris's hawks. Oh, we haven't even started to think about owls, which are sometimes raptors and sometimes aren't. There's the tawny owl, the great horned owl, and the barn owl. And so the point being here is that there's a broad spectrum of visual acuity within birds that are typically thought of as raptors, and how you measure it can make a difference, right? The other thing that can make a difference is that this is looking essentially at the same thing on a smaller group of species. So Orlowski et al. Looked at, and we're focused on barn owl vision, and measured visual acuity, which is on the y-axis here. And they actually did it in different conditions, right? So wherever you test are the conditions that you run a test on when you're measuring visual acuity or some other metric of how well an animal sees. Conditions can affect that. And so you've got this down here towards the left is dark, so nocturnal conditions, almost no light to a little bit of light and mesotopic, and then very bright. And so you can see that humans have pretty high visual acuity in bright light, as do falcons, which are just slightly a little bit higher. But when conditions change, that acuity changes and humans drop off rather quickly, right? When you talk about how well an animal sees, when you think about owls, most owls are either crepuscular or nocturnal, and so that's low light conditions. And while the barn owl or the great horned owl or the tawny owl might not have the highest visual acuity in high light situations, the interesting thing to see about those groups is that their acuity drops off far less in low light levels, so they see better in low light. And so again, it matters how you take this metric, and talking and thinking about exceptional vision or keen eyesight is kind of nebulous. It depends on how you define it and how you measure it. So it may not be the best criteria for inclusion in a group. If we go to the other sharp, we've got sharp talons to catch and hold prey, right? And Leslie Brown describing African birds of prey that they all have, except for the vultures, powerful grasping feet that are equipped with long, sharp talons, right? And so um, vultures are the exception. Here's a turkey vulture with, you wouldn't necessarily call those feet strong or powerful. You wouldn't necessarily call those talons curved or sharp. Here's a golden eaglefoot, which definitely fits that definition, right? So there's a gradient, there's some variation. Again, the point is that sharp, curved, and strong are pretty ambiguous descriptors, and they're not super useful for separating raptors out from other birds, right? Here's the more grasping feet, right? Parrots can grasp food. They have very feet that are built for grasping. There's parrot and shrikes, which are a songbird in Passeriformes. They grasp their prey. Here's a shrike with a mouse, right? So do we include these groups as raptors or not? And then the third sharp are hooked beaks, right? So a hooked upper bill for tearing food. And then here are just a couple examples of sometimes raptors or not raptors at all, images of other birds that have um, sharp hooked upper bills for tearing food, like parrots or cormorants or gulls or, again, shrikes. These may describe raptors as a group, but they're not diagnostic traits. So when you think about raptors as a group, we just covered morphology. So you might think about a raptorial morphology, having those three sharps, right? Sharp vision, sharp talons, sharp beaks. And there are some groups that we commonly think of raptors that would fall within this circle. For sure, within the Accipitriformes, there's the hawks, the harriers, the osprey, and the eagles. The falcons do, owls do, and seriemas do. But outside of that group of those groups of birds that are sometimes considered raptors, shrikes and ravens don't have all three of those characteristics. New World and Old World vultures don't as well, and all the predatory seabirds not necessarily have that three combinations. So we get close to defining these groups that we think of as raptors with these traits, but it's not a completely clean definition, and it's hard to include or exclude species in those groups just on those things alone. So we talk about morphology. Again, it describes, but it doesn't define. It doesn't help us include or exclude. It gives us clues about the ecology of these animals. It gives us clues that they're predatory. It gives us clues that they're land birds. And you can start to think about the evolution of those traits together, which can be helpful. But morphology alone isn't necessarily a good way to just define raptors, right? So you can think about the ecology of raptors and sort of the role or the function that raptors play in on the landscape. And one big break we can take is just we talk about raptors, let's just call them land birds. And so that excludes predatory seabirds. Also to exclude things like insectivorous warblers and other bird groups, for instance. Instead of just being a predator on something, we tend to think of raptors for the most part as being a predator on vertebrates, at least some portion of their diet, right? So we can think about that in terms of the role or function that ecology plays. And so we'll talk about the ecological raptor, if you want to think about that way in a second, and then we'll start to talk about evolution and taking an evolutionary perspective about raptors. So raptors are predatory, they're land birds. Sometimes these roles have also been broken up into diurnal and nocturnal, like that's what was used as a criteria for including or excluding owls, right? And then there's some of those other species that hunt vertebrate prey that are also land birds. So they function in their systems that they occur in sometimes as raptors. Here's a roadrunner with lizard prey. Here's a shrike stashing a bird on a barb. And then there's the raven that in many cases will take vertebrate prey, will scavenge, and shares a lot of similar nesting and breeding habitat similarities to a lot of raptors. And so many authors, like Booms et al. In their paper, consider and will include ravens when they're thinking about a suite of cliff nesting raptors because they're somewhat similar ecologically. So there's functional raptors. So we add that and we think about functional raptors preying on terrestrial vertebrates having similar ecological role. here's that circle, and it starts to include these same groups. And in doing so, we can include roadrunners or the shrikes and the ravens at sometimes, and that gets us to um, including more of these groups that have occasionally been thought of as raptors. But we're still excluding some groups. We're really not thinking about the New World vultures or the Old World vultures, specifically checking all of those boxes here, or predatory seabirds, which we've already excluded, right? So we got to think about evolution and evolutionary links to raptor groups. And so really quickly going to zoom out and do a evolution um, 101 tutorial, and we're going to think about phylogenies and the relatedness of different species and different groups of species and how all of those things come together, right? So here's a picture of a simple phylogeny. It's an evolutionary tree. And so you've got either group or species A, B through J, right? And these links, these trees, describe their level of relatedness and whether or not they have shared common ancestors or not, right? So a monophyletic group, which is either this entire picture here or this boxed in blue area here, is a group that if you just take one cut on the tree, you take the whole group with you, right? So it includes a common ancestor and all of the descendants of that common ancestor, right? Um, Phylobiologists think of it differently too. We have other definitions of different kinds of groups, and I'm going to take time to talk about paraphyletic groups, right? This is a group that includes a common ancestor, but excludes other members of that group. So it doesn't have all of that ancestor's descendants, right? So in the case of this pink box, B, C, and D are a paraphyletic group because they share a common ancestor, but it's not monophyletic because it does not include member A within this group, right? So you can think of this, shared ancestors at each of these nodes, and the branches further down are divergences of groups or species within those different groups, right? So it's a simple kind of way of thinking about phylogenies. This is the same concept, but just putting some real species to it, right? This shows evolutionary connections, where the divergence between the groups are and how related we think different species of mimids here, thrashers and mockingbirds are in this example, right? So here's the branch. Each little split is a node, and then taxa or species that are most closely related are oftentimes thought of as sister taxa. They're more like one another than they are any of the other groups in this branch, right? So here's phylogeny. And if we zoom out, so this is just a portion of the Mimidae, the Mimid family. If you jump back out, this is that exact same graph, and you can see the part here circled, but it's replaced the common names of these birds with scientific names, and it's included all the rest of the members of that family, right? So it gets pretty complex and complicated really quick, but here's the phylogeny geography of the mimids, right? And so biologists work to do that for this group. They work to do that for here is a comprehensive phylogeny of birds, all birds. Pruman all published this in Nature. So this is really complex, hard to think of, but it basically puts together all the relationships of all known and defined groups and extant groups of birds right now. And what I want to focus on is this right page here around this circle. This includes all of what we might think of as the land birds. And if we actually don't think about all of the different genuses within here and just kind of step back out to a branch, we get to a much simpler way of thinking about this. And here we have a phylogeny of orders, right, that include what you just saw here. It's just contracted to be basically the core land bird orders that we have defined right now, right? The songbirds, the parrots, the falcons, the sirenimas, New World vultures, the hawks and eagles, including the Old World vultures, owls, and this is a super order that includes a whole lot of birds, including woodpeckers and cuckoos and all those sorts of things. So if we think about these evolutionary links, all of these land bird orders, these core land birds, had a common ancestor. And I mentioned before with a picture of the dinosaur, the velociraptor, is that all birds have a link to a common shared ancestor that was a dinosaur. They're the continuation of the dinosaur line, the theropod dinosaurs, which includes raptorial dinosaurs like T-Rex and velociraptors. But at some point here in this phylogeny, the shared ancestor of these orders of core land birds was also raptorial. And that's the big if in our thinking about raptors. We can kind of think about raptors as retaining those, maintaining those raptorial lifestyles and traits or not. And so here's the core raptor ancestor group, right? And if you look at the Cathartiformes, the New World vultures, and the Accipitriformes, these are hawks, eagles, osprey, old world vultures, and harriers, right? They, for the most part, all of the species within these orders and these groups tend to still be fairly raptorial for the most part, right? So you can bunch them in together as a group. Same thing with the owls. They've kept, if this was a raptorial ancestor, the owl group has maintained that trait and that lifestyle for the most part, most members of the owl order, right? Whereas members of this super order have not, right? They basically have adapted and branched off and taken on a different route of lifestyle, and the majority of members of this group don't tend to retain and maintain and keep raptor traits, right? Raptorial traits, predatory traits, if you think of it that way. So you can think of this group as a paraphyletic group that are retaining those raptorial traits on this branch. We can go up and look at the same thing for falcons, and it's the same story. Most falcons and caracaras retain those raptorial traits, right? And I guess it's probably worth noting, you know, if you've paid attention to raptor phylogeny in the past, is that, you know, before not too long ago, the Accipitriformes and the Falconiformes were all considered one group, and then recent research has changed that phylogeny to lump falcons up more closely with these other orders. And so that really started to make how we define raptors a little messier, because it wasn't just diurnal raptors and owls, it was multiple orders, right? So we're not talking about a monophyletic group anymore. We look at the Cariiformes, these are the Seriemas. This is another group of order of birds. There's two extant species, and the two members of that species, the Seriemas, they are still predatory. They still have a sharp beak. They have some sharp talons. They're similar to secretary birds, which are in the Accipitriformes. And so they actually, you know, still have those raptorial traits from a shared ancestor, if that's the case too. Parrots and songbirds have, again, just like this group down here, diverged, and the majority of members of those groups don't have athletic group retaining raptorial traits. And if we include them all, then we end up with 5 orders of birds that, for the most part, their members eat vertebrates. They have a raptorial lifestyle that they got from their common ancestor of the order down here, and that starts to become a more definable, defensible, tangible way of defining a group such as raptors when you think about it that way. But you know, the new addition to raptors with this way of thinking about it is the Seriema, and Jarvis et al. Addressed that when they published their phylogeny, is that the Seriema could be considered to belong to a raptorial taxon because they kill vertebrate prey, and they're the sole living relatives of the extinct giant terror birds that were apex predators that would have been horrifying back during the Paleocene. And so there's an argument to be made for including Seriemas as raptors here too. So if we think about not only morphological raptors, functional raptors, but we think of it from an evolutionary perspective, we get to the point that we now have a definition of raptors that includes all of the raptor groups that have typically been thought of and addressed as raptors, meaning the hawks and the eagles, the falcons, the owls. We add Seriemas, and we include all the vultures in taking this approach. And what we end up doing is that approach excludes some of the functional raptors in terms of the shrikes and the ravens, which are songbirds. You know, they are part of an order where most of their ancestors have not maintained that lifestyle, and so we posit that they're not raptors because of that. And you can see that in this table down here, right? That was a lot to take in with your lunch. Hopefully you're close to done. So raptors are species within orders that evolved from raptorial land birds, in which most of the species in the order still has that raptorial lifestyle, right? Now you know. And now you know something about the Siriema, which you probably hadn't heard of before. Uh, this approach to defining raptors, it includes the groups that we regularly have conversed and talked and sometimes argued about. And it's a clearer criteria for whether a species is a raptor or not, right? And whether you like it or not, I think we can all agree that raptors are cool. Hopefully you learned something during this session. And I think we can have a few questions if you want to. And like I said, Chris, if I messed something up, you want to let me know, go for it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for that, Dave. We haven't had any questions come through in the chat just yet, but we will give it a minute. I didn't know.
It's all crystal clear, right?
I mean, there was a lot to take in. I didn't know about Siriemas, and now I want to take a bite out of science about terror birds. Um,
Right.
I'm seeing that Chris says that this was great. So apparently you got everything perfectly correct.
Awesome.
Donna says, tell me again how warblers are raptors.
Warblers are not raptors. So the whole criteria for being a land bird and taking vertebrate prey would rule warblers out, and that was an example for we can't just say predatory. Raptor or warblers prey on insects and larvae, right? So if you, in strict definition of what a predator is, it includes a lot of other things. And when you start to get particular about thinking about raptors, it has to be for the most part vertebrate prey, right? And so that excludes groups like warblers and other predatory birds. Siriemas live in South America.
And we have a request to go back to the last couple of slides. Maybe that will help
Here.
clarify. Donna, let us know if you need us to go further back.
So everything in this dotted box right here are orders that we are thinking of as raptors. They've retained that raptorial, predatory, land bird, vertebrate prey lifestyle.
All right, the $1,000,000 question, Dave. What's your favorite raptor?
You know, that's a great question. It depends, just like the vision, it depends on how you're measuring it, right? Um, you know, the raptor I spent the most time on are a lot of groups of small owls. So flammulated owls are pretty cool. Spent a lot of time with kestrels. Kestrels are amazing birds. I like the attitudes of merlins, and I want to find money and start a study of Seriemas because now that they're raptors, why not?
I love it. Okay, so Donna has a follow-up question. So her flammies eat mostly non-vertebrates.
They do. So they are in Stratiformes, so they're amongst that group of owls. They now have a mostly insectivorous lifestyle, for sure. You're seeing that on some of that video that you're documenting food deliveries. But most of the members of that order take vertebrate prey. And it's also worth noting that you keep watching some of that video footage because there's a good chance you may see vertebrate prey being brought in by those flammulated owls too. We've seen them bring in songbirds, mice, deer mice, and even bats. So they're mostly insectivorous, but they do on occasion take vertebrate prey.
Great. It's not as clear cut as we might want it to be, huh?
Yeah, but I think, still talking about those features that make a good predator, it's not, like I said, there's no judgment in thinking about how we define this. It's just important to realize that you can't say yes raptor, no raptor based on eyesight alone, or how hooked a bill is, or how sharp or powerful feet are.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I am not seeing any other questions in the chat. Thank you, Dave. This was great. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. We're hopeful that you learned a little bit about raptors and why we consider different birds raptors and why we don't consider others. If you have any follow-up questions, let us know. But thanks for joining us for lunch.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, y'all.